They thought they had found a military secret. It was December 1944, deep in the frozen ruins outside Bastogne. The 26th Volksgrenadier Division had taken over an abandoned farmhouse, its walls cracked by artillery and its floor scattered with American gear. Under a broken desk, a German corporal named Karl Meissner noticed a folder marked with a red star. When he opened it, he expected a map. Instead, on a thin sheet of paper, drawn with a trembling child's hand, was a house with smoke curling from the chimney, a small dog, and a man in uniform holding a little girl's hand. At the bottom were words written in uneven English letters, "For Daddy, come home soon." The men around him laughed at first, a nervous, sharp laughter that filled the silence of the ruined room. But when another soldier muttered that it might belong to the American they had captured the night before, the sound died away. Outside, snow was falling on shell casings, and the air smelled faintly of gasoline and burnt wood. Karl folded the paper carefully, as if it might shatter, and slipped it into the pocket of his gray tunic. He would carry it through the rest of the Ardennes campaign, through the retreat across the Rhine, even into captivity months later. He never told anyone why. That night, huddled near the farmhouse stove, he unfolded it again under the weak light of a candle stub. He thought of his own daughter, Greta, back in Dresden. She would be 6 by now, if the bombings hadn't reached their street yet. He realized with a dull ache that the little American girl had drawn the same kind of house, the same crooked smile. For a moment, uniform and flag meant nothing. Only the distance between fathers and daughters did. War had stripped men of names, turned them into ranks and serial numbers, but this drawing, clumsy, childish, sincere, returned the names. It whispered across languages, cutting through the noise of propaganda and fear. It said what no order could. Remember who you were before you carried a rifle. A week later, the same farmhouse would be overrun. The Germans fled in the night, leaving behind weapons, rations, and bodies. But Karl kept the folded paper close to his chest, tucked near his heart like a letter. In March 1945, when he was captured near Remagen, the American MPs searching him paused over the fragile drawing. One of them said softly, "Hey, this looks like something from home." Karl said nothing. He simply nodded, as if the secret belonged to both of them. Years later, long after he returned to the ruins of Dresden, he would still remember that paper, how it felt warmer than the coat he wore. The drawing survived longer than many of the soldiers who fought in that frozen forest. If you value stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps preserve forgotten chapters of history. And as you listen, share where you are watching from and what time it is now. Because somewhere, someone's story still waits to be found under the dust of war. April 1945. Berlin was no longer a city. It was a wound that wouldn't close. Smoke drifted like ghosts through streets split open by bombs. The Reichstag was a shell, the air thick with chalk dust and the hum of collapse. In a bunker beneath the Friedrichstrasse subway station, a Wehrmacht private named Hans Adler sat against a damp wall, a piece of charcoal trembling in his fingers. Around him lay the debris of a lost army, helmets, boots, and silence. He was drawing. His comrade, Otto Bremer, leaned over the candlelight, watching the faint lines take shape, cheekbones, eyes, the curve of a mouth. It was the face of another soldier, Ernst, who had died 2 days earlier from a sniper's bullet. "Why draw him?" Otto asked quietly. "He's gone." Hans didn't look up. His voice was barely a whisper. "So he won't disappear again." Outside, artillery echoed through the streets like distant thunder. Somewhere, the Soviets were crossing the Spree. Inside the bunker, time stood still. A dozen men watched as Hans pressed charcoal to stone, retracing his friend's face over and over until it seemed to breathe through the cracks. He had been an art student before the war, just 18 when the draft notice arrived. He'd traded pencils for a rifle, sketchbooks for orders. Now, at the end, with the city dying around him, he wanted only to remember a human face. Not a flag, not a Führer, just a face. When the Red Army entered Berlin on May 2nd, the men in the bunker surrendered without a word. Days later, Soviet soldiers sweeping through the tunnels found the drawing still there. A man's portrait, faint but stubbornly visible through soot. One of the soldiers, a young Ukrainian named Alexei Petrov, tore it from the wall carefully and rolled it into his pack. Years later, it would appear in the Treptow Museum, labeled simply Unidentified German Soldier, Berlin, 1945. No one ever learned Hans Adler's fate. His name vanished into prisoner lists and burned records, but his drawing survived. A fragile piece of evidence that even in the last hours of the Reich, someone had still chosen to remember beauty instead of hatred. The museum curator, who later cataloged it, wrote in his diary, "This is not propaganda, this is mourning." He noted the detail that few visitors noticed, a single fingerprint smudged near the eye, as if the artist had tried to wipe away a tear. The bunker has long since been sealed, buried under asphalt and memory. But beneath that ground, under the same layers of silence, lies the story of a young man who refused to let his friend vanish into the noise of history. In war, so many vanish twice, once when they die, and again when they're forgotten. And sometimes, the last thing that keeps them alive is a line drawn in the dark. Normandy, June 1944. The rain had turned the fields into swamps and the air into iron. Amid the shattered stone of a French village near St. Lo, an American combat artist named Lieutenant Raymond Walker crouched beside a wall, sketching the smoking ruins. His mission was not to fight, but to capture what fighting did to men and places. His pencil traced a woman's body covered by a sheet, a child's shoe in the mud, a church without a steeple. He never finished. At 11:47 a.m., a single rifle shot cut through the drizzle. The bullet pierced both the paper and his chest. The sketch fluttered into the mud beside him. A village drawn in graphite, a heart stopped mid-line. 2 days later, medics recovered the sketch. It was stained with rain and blood, the bullet hole perfectly centered over the figure of a kneeling man. They placed it in an envelope marked Walker R. Deceased. It was sent to a military archive, forgotten among thousands of wartime records. Decades passed. Then in 1983, a former Wehrmacht sniper named Friedrich Kappel visited the same archive while participating in a reconciliation program between German and American veterans. A curator handed him an exhibit draft labeled Unidentified Sketch Normandy 1944. Friedrich froze. He knew the angle, the village, the wall. His hands trembled as he saw the bullet hole. "That was my position," he whispered. "I fired that shot." He had been 19, and his notebook from that day, now brittle with age, as he had written, "Target seen near church ruins, no return fire." He never knew he had shot an artist instead of a soldier. Haunted, he reached out to the soldier's son, David Walker, who had become a professor of art history. Their meeting in 1984 in Boston was quiet, almost wordless. Friedrich brought the sketch, still folded, the hole like an unhealed wound. He handed it over and said only, "I came to return what I broke." David later displayed the piece in his university gallery under a single light. He refused to repair the hole. "It belongs there," he told visitors. That's the moment they met. The exhibit drew veterans from both sides. Some wept. Others stood in silence. One visitor, an elderly nurse, wrote in the guest book, "War tears the paper, but not the drawing." That sentence became the title of a short documentary in 1987, and the sketch remains on display today, still punctured, still whispering the truth that violence can never erase the mark of what was human. Numbers can describe the scale of war: 425,000 casualties in Normandy alone, 1.2 million shells fired. But none of them tell what one line of graphite could. That line was the boundary between an artist and a sniper, between memory and guilt, between two men who never met, yet changed each other forever. Nebraska, 1944. The Great Plains stretched endlessly beneath a hard blue sky, wind whispering through the barbed wire of Fort Robinson, one of the 500 prisoner of war camps scattered across the United States. Here, over 3,000 captured German soldiers lived behind fences of quiet boredom, miles from the battlefields that had once defined their lives. To the Americans, these men were no longer enemies, just statistics. Prisoner Labor Unit Camp 17B. But to the prisoners themselves, time moved like a slow injury. Each sunrise was the same, every task rehearsed: cleaning, digging, waiting. Then, one hot July morning, a small change arrived, a shipment of paper and pencils. Recreation supplies, the quartermaster's note said, to reduce stress. The guards passed them out through the wire. At first, the prisoners didn't know what to do. Some drew maps of the roads they would never walk again. Others sketched faces from memory, wives, sons, home kitchens, half forgotten by hunger and distance. And one, Obergefreiter Karl Meissner, the same man who had once found a child's drawing in the ruins of Bastogne, began to draw landscapes, not of Germany, but of what he saw each day: the American horizon, the grain silos, the silent mountains on the edge of the plains. One afternoon, a U.S. lieutenant named John Carter noticed him sketching near the fence. Carter was 24, from Kansas City, a teacher before the war. He asked in slow English, "May I see?" Carl hesitated, then handed the paper through the wire. Carter studied it for a long moment, then sat down on the other side and began drawing too. Two men, one in khaki, one in field gray, sketching the same skyline, separated only by a strip of wire and the weight of history. They continued for hours, passing the paper back and forth. Carter shaded the clouds, Carl traced the grass. When they finished, each signed half of the horizon. On one corner, Karl Meissner, Wehrmacht. On the other, Lieutenant John Carter, U.S. Army. The guards kept the drawing. It ended up in a storage box. Then later, somehow, in the Library of Congress archives, labeled Untitled, Joint POW Artwork, Fort Robinson, 1944. A war diary from the camp recorded that day's temperature, 91 degrees Fahrenheit. Nothing else. No mention of the moment when two enemies shared a pencil and drew the same world. After the war, Carl returned to Germany and became a machinist. Carter went home to Missouri and taught history. They never met again. But years later, when the drawing was rediscovered and displayed in Washington, D.C., visitors often paused before it. No battle scene, no blood, just one endless landscape, two signatures, and a fence no longer there. Historians who studied it called it an accidental peace treaty, but perhaps it was something simpler. Two men proving that imagination could cross what hatred built. Outside, in the wide silence of Nebraska, the prairie still looks the same. Maybe somewhere in that vastness, the wind still carries the memory of two pencils scratching against the same piece of paper. Texas, late 1944. The air smelled of dust and bread. At Camp Hearn, one of the largest POW sites in America, over 4,000 German soldiers spent their days building furniture, tending crops, or staring through the wire toward a country that treated its captives with routines, but not cruelty. Among them was Corporal Dieter Wolf, 27, former architecture student from Munich. He had a habit of sketching when the guards weren't looking, not propaganda, not battles, just what he saw. Sunlight falling on the tin roofs, the trucks delivering flour, the faces of men who longed for home, but no longer knew where home was. One afternoon, he saw something strange. An American sergeant knelt to hand a piece of bread to a thin prisoner who had fainted during roll call. The gesture lasted seconds, but it burned into Dieter's mind. That night, by candlelight in the barracks, he drew it. The guard's hand extended, the bread caught in midair, the prisoner's eyes half closed in disbelief. The next morning, his bunkmate, Sergeant Klaus Reinhardt, saw the sketch. "Tear it up," he hissed. "It's a lie. The enemy doesn't feed us." Dieter shook his head. "It happened." "Then it shouldn't have," Klaus replied. "If you show this, they'll think you've gone soft." 2 days later, a German officer in charge of internal discipline found the drawing hidden under a mattress. He ordered Dieter to destroy it. Dieter refused. He was placed in solitary confinement, 7 days in a dark shed with only water and 2 slices of bread. When he was released, the sketch was gone. But an American guard, Private Charles Bowers, had quietly retrieved it before the burn order. After the war, Bowers mailed it to the Red Cross art collection with a note, drawn by a prisoner who believed kindness should be remembered. In 1946, the drawing was displayed in a small New York exhibition titled Art Behind Barbed Wire. Visitors stopped before it, surprised by its warmth. There was no hatred, no flags, only 2 hands meeting across a piece of bread. One critic called it the smallest peace treaty of the Second World War. For years, the identity of the artist remained unknown until a researcher traced the initials in the corner, DW, 1944. By then, Dieter Wolf had died of tuberculosis in 1951. His family never knew his work survived. The piece now hangs in a small military museum in San Antonio, beside a caption that reads, "Drawn in captivity, preserved in gratitude." If you were in his place, would you have risked punishment just to draw something kind? Would you have let truth cost you your freedom, even for a few lines on paper? Because sometimes the most dangerous act in war isn't defiance. It's remembering that the enemy is human. Winter of 1945, Alabama. The war in Europe was ending, and the camp infirmaries overflowed with men, broken not by bullets, but by silence. In one of them, Camp Aliceville Hospital, lay a German prisoner named Wilhelm Krauss. He had been a draftsman before the war, known for steady hands and fine lines, but during an Allied air raid in Italy, shrapnel had torn through his right arm. The surgeons had to amputate below the elbow. For weeks, he barely spoke. He watched others play cards or write letters and stared at his empty sleeve as if it were a separate ghost. To him, life after war meant nothing. Without his hand, he could neither draw nor build. Then one morning, an American nurse named Evelyn Carter walked by his bed and noticed him tracing invisible lines in the air. She asked, "What were you drawing?" He turned away, ashamed. She smiled gently and returned the next day with a small gift, a pencil tied to a string. She looped it around his left wrist and said, "Try again." The first attempts were pitiful. The pencil slipped, the lines shook. But the next day he tried again, sketching the outline of her face as she changed bandages nearby. Slowly, a rough portrait emerged, uneven, fragile, alive. Evelyn laughed softly when she saw it. "You still see better than most men," she said. Wilhelm began to draw daily. He filled scrap paper with portraits of nurses, soldiers, even fellow prisoners. Some traded him cigarettes for sketches. Others simply watched, astonished that he could draw with a single wrist and a will stronger than pain. The camp commander, seeing the morale it brought, ordered paper supplies increased. For the first time, art became part of recovery. A report from that year noted, prisoner morale improved markedly through drawing activities. It was a bureaucratic understatement. For Wilhelm, it was resurrection. When the war ended, he was repatriated through Bremerhaven. In his final medical file, an American officer wrote one line, "Patient requests to keep drawing materials." Back in Hamburg, he opened a tiny studio in the ruins of his neighborhood. Using the same left wrist and a strap, he painted portraits of doctors and nurses who had worked during the war. His most famous piece, "The Hand That Could Not Kill," showed a soldier's severed arm holding a pencil instead of a rifle. It was displayed in a 1952 exhibit on war rehabilitation, captioned simply, "Gifted by an American nurse." Years later, when Evelyn Carter visited Germany as part of a Red Cross delegation, she was led into that gallery. Before her hung her own younger face, rendered not with precision, but with gratitude. She cried quietly and whispered, "He finished it." What destroys hate faster, defeat or kindness? Maybe the answer lives somewhere between a wound and a pencil tied to a wrist. Cambridge, Massachusetts, autumn 2018. In a quiet storage wing beneath the Harvard University Library, archivist Dr. Laura Benton opened a long-sealed Red Cross crate labeled POW Correspondence, 1944. Inside lay letters, sketches, and forgotten scraps of humanity. Among them was a small drawing, folded 3 times, the paper yellowed but intact. In the bottom corner, faint but legible, was a signature, Gefferich Reiner, 1944. The sketch depicted 6 men sitting at a wooden table, 3 in U.S. Army uniforms, 3 in the gray tunics of German POWs. They were laughing. Behind them, faintly visible, barbed wire blurred into the sky. Someone had written a short English phrase beneath it. "We both waited for peace." Benton contacted the Smithsonian's Wartime Studies Division. After 6 months of verification, historians confirmed the drawing's origin, Camp Shanks, New York, where thousands of captured German soldiers were processed before repatriation. The artist, Heinrich Reiner, was a 23-year-old artillery gunner who had worked as a sign painter before the war. Camp Shanks's records noted that by late 1944, the guards and prisoners had formed an informal art group. They painted signs, decorated Christmas cards, even made a mural for the dining hall. Scenes not of victory, but of harvest fields and rivers. The men who had once fired at each other now competed over whose brushwork looked more like sunlight. Heinrich's sketch was likely drawn during one of those sessions. In a letter to his mother, found later in the same crate, he had written, "I no longer see uniforms when I draw faces, only the lines time has made." When the drawing went on public display in 2019, veterans, students, and historians gathered around the small frame in silence. Some noticed the subtle details, the shared tin mug on the table, the single pencil passed between hands. Others focused on the faces, not idealized, not heroic, simply human. An old man approached the exhibit one afternoon and told the curator he had been a camp cook at Shanks. His name was Harold Jackson, age 93. "That was my table," he said quietly. "I remember those boys. They drew everything. One of them told me, 'If I draw, I'm free for a minute.'" The curator asked him what became of them. Harold smiled faintly. "We all went home. Maybe that's enough." The image of men once divided by war sharing a pencil became a sensation online, reprinted in newspapers across the US and Germany. Historians called it proof that art outlived hate. One headline read, "When war ended in a drawing." No one knows what happened to Heinrich Reiner after repatriation. His trail ends in Bavaria, 1950, but his drawing survived, traveling silently through decades of archives, outliving the men who made it. And maybe that's the quiet victory no one counted. Not in territory, not in medals, but in a piece of paper that remembered peace before the world did. Because perhaps the real triumph of war is not who conquered the ground, but who kept drawing when everything else had stopped. When the war finally ended, Europe became a museum of ruins. Cities rebuilt their walls faster than they rebuilt their souls. But somewhere between those shattered stones and forgotten archives, fragments of paper survived, small drawings, unsigned or smudged, carrying the pulse of what humanity refused to surrender. Each sketch told a story not of armies, but of individuals. Karl's trembling hands holding a child's drawing in Bastogne, Hans's charcoal portrait glowing faintly in a Berlin tunnel, the bullet hole that united a sniper and an artist, the two signatures on a shared Nebraska horizon, the forbidden picture of bread and mercy, the nurse who helped a man draw without hands, and finally, Heinrich Reiner's laughter on paper, the sound of reconciliation captured in graphite. No general wrote these. No government preserved them for propaganda. They endured because someone, somewhere, chose not to burn them. They existed because men who had been trained to kill remembered, even for a second, what it meant to create. Art is the only language that war cannot silence. It survives in margins, on napkins, on the backs of orders, in the dust of bombed houses, and the notebooks of prisoners. It waits quietly for history to stop shouting so that it can speak again. The soldiers who once hid these drawings did not know they were preserving evidence of compassion. Yet decades later, these same sketches would travel to museums, classrooms, and screens, reminding us that between enemies, there was always a line drawn not by hate, but by recognition. A historian once wrote that every war leaves behind two ruins, the visible one made of cities and the invisible one made of hearts. But the men who drew inside their cages built something else, a bridge. Perhaps that is why these images still move us. They are not about victory or defeat. They are about endurance, the stubborn insistence that even amid violence, beauty can still exist. And so the drawing found under the dust of Bastogne, passed through pockets, bunkers, camps, and archives, becomes the single, unbroken line connecting all of them. Proof that humanity, against all odds, survived its own uniform.